morning we're in a late model Jeep with a 6-liter LS engine and a 6L80 transmission. This has the Banks gauge, but it's not on because I'm using my torque. I really like torque because I can take it with me wherever I go. It's on my phone, it's an app. You can get torque and torque pro. Torque pro has more parameters and allows you to import custom or manufacturer PIDs. So this Jeep is a two-door. We do a lot of two-doors, but some people are confused. Can you do a conversion on a two-door? And what's the difference? Well, of course we can do conversions on two-doors. We've been doing it for over a decade. But there are some differences. Pretty much everything from the grille to the firewall is identical. It starts to change once you get back to the exhaust. The two-door is a shorter Jeep, so the fuel tank, while smaller, goes basically right up to the cross member, so you can't run the exhaust between the fuel tank and the transmission like you can on the four-doors. And by doing that, you can run flat skids. Everything stays above the cross member. The way Jeep does it, and most of the other companies, is they run the exhaust pipe under the transmission right in front of the cross member. Now they do flatten the pipe a little bit, but it does stick down a little, and it does put more heat into the transmission pan. But that's what you got to do on the two-door exhaust system. We wrap all of our exhaust systems, so we don't really have a problem with heat. One of the biggest concerns with a two-door is the drive shaft angle, because you're losing a lot of drive shaft length in the rear. The front basically stays the same. If your Jeep is relatively stock, you don't have much of a lift, you really got nothing to worry about. But we get two-doors in here that have 6-inch lifts, and the drive shaft angle is ridiculous. So a lot of things come into play there. One, having adjustable control arms helps a lot. Two, having separation angle control helps a lot. What I mean by that is if you take a stock two-door JK, put a 6-inch lift on it, the rear drive shaft angle is ridiculous. Even the RZEPA probably isn't going to handle it. So you can put adjustable control arms on because the stock control arms aren't adjustable. There's cam plates, but I don't like those. So you start rolling the rear pinion up to match the output of the transfer case, and what you find is the springs start aiming backwards, and the sway bar mounts are no longer level, and in some cases not even usable anymore. So what you need to do is you need to separate all those brackets from the pinion, roll the pinion where you want it to be, and then weld all those brackets on. And that's how we do custom two-door builds. Like with Dynatrac and Curry, you can order the axles tacked. The brackets are just tacked, and then you can put it wherever you want and then weld it. With the production axles, whether it's a stock JK or a Dana, you're pretty much stuck with what you get. So you got to be careful when you lift a two-door. We've been very lucky. Most of our two-doors have zero vibration. In fact, the Jeep I'm in right now has no vibration. But I do get customers coming in and they say, hey, I've got a driveline vibration of 65 miles an hour, and this is before we ever do the engine conversion. And that's really important, guys. If you have a pre-existing problem, tell us, because then it's something we can address during the swap. I can't tell you how many times I get Jeeps come in, and then when I go to do my test drive, they say, oh, by the way, I have an intermittent ABS light or whatever, and it just would make it a lot easier if you tell us if you have an issue before you bring the Jeep in for the conversion. So with a two-door, going to a high pinion rear obviously would be advantageous, but that can get expensive, and a lot of you guys can't do that. The LS powertrain moves the transfer case back about 1 inch, which isn't very much. In a lot of cases with a stock JK, if you have the RZEPA shafts, they'll even work. In fact, my original two-door or four-door that we did back in 2008, 2009 era has the stock RZEPA in it, and it's been in there for over 200,000 miles. Once you start lifting a JK, especially if you don't have adjustable control arms, that starts pulling the axles inward. So if you move the transfer case back and you pull the axle inward through a lift, that rear drive shaft's going to be too long. A lot of it depends on the lift you get. Manufacturers like Metal Cloak and Synergy, they know that when you lift the Jeep, they got to push the axle back in order to center it. So not only are their arms adjustable, but they make the arms inherently longer, usually about 1 inch, to push that axle back where it needs to be. Any suspension problems that you have in a four-door is going to be worse in a two-door because it's short coupled. The longer the wheelbase, the more stable the vehicle is. The advantage of the short wheelbase obviously is the maneuverability. When you get it off-road, you can whip around turns. I've had to do 3-point turns in my JK four-door where a two-door TJ or LJ could go around that turn without doing a 3-point turn. But the advantage of the four-door with a longer wheelbase is stability. The LJ is becoming really popular because basically it's a stretched TJ. Some guys think that the JK four-door is too long, so they get a two-door and they stretch it. It's a lot of work. But the bottom line is the shorter coupled the vehicle, the more critical the suspension setup is. And I've driven some pretty squirrely two-doors, and when you put horsepower on them, that gets even worse. So make sure your pinion angle is set up correctly, front and rear, to avoid vibrations. The two-door has a smaller fuel tank. I think it's about 18 gallons versus the JK's 22 gallons. So that gives you a shorter range. Auxiliary fuel tanks are becoming popular, whether you put the Gen Right style tank in the back, and there's alternatives now. Long Rangers on the side. And I really see the advantage to that because I just drove 6,000 miles to New York, Florida, and then back to Vegas and up to Utah in our Denali. And our Denali, I don't know how many gallons it holds, and had almost a 700-mile range. That's incredible. Was getting about 22 miles to the gallon in a 6.2 LT L86 in a fully loaded down Denali, and we even had a trailer carrier on it. I'll tell you, the LT motors really shine when you get them out in the open highway. So having that 700-mile range meant that I had to stop half as much as I normally do in a JK, because most of the JKs I drive get 250 to 300 miles on the outside range. And that gets even worse with modded Jeeps, especially like the old 3.8. Guys are reporting 9 miles to the gallon, 10 miles to the gallon. Most of our Jeeps will get into teens. But if you're getting 9 miles to the gallon on 18 gallons, you're not going very far. So in a two-door, economy might be more of a consideration. The two-door is a little bit lighter than the four-door, obviously, because there's less metal in it. And you might consider just going with a 5.3 LT instead of the 6.2. Don't get me wrong, the 6.2 is awesome, but the 5.3 has plenty of power for a two-door. It's going to get a little bit better economy, and it's going to increase your range a little bit. And let's take a second to look at fuel economy. Guys complain, I'm getting 9 miles to the gallon, I'm getting 12 miles to the gallon. And there's so many variables in fuel economy. It's not just the engine that you have, it's the aerodynamic drag, how much lift do you have, what size are your tires, how wide are your tires, how sticky are your tires, are you running the proper air pressure? I get guys come in and say, hey, I'm getting 10 miles a gallon, and they got 40-inch tires at 14 PSI. And that's a tremendous amount of drag. You try pushing that vehicle and you'll see what I'm talking about. I try to optimize fuel economy on my long distance drives. I make sure the tires are inflated properly. I remove any extraneous things hanging off the Jeep like CB antennas and things that don't need to be there. Things like LED bars and putting lights everywhere definitely have an effect on fuel economy. So that's not a two-door thing, that's just common sense. What's really important with the two-door is that you set it up properly, especially if you have a high horsepower engine. I've done LT1s and two-doors, and I can tell you that they can be a handful, especially if you have really floppy suspension. And since a lot of us go out and wheel, rather than doing high-speed pre-runner stuff, we want to go out and wheel on the rocks. In fact, right here in Red Rock, on the backside of these mountains, is a mecca for wheeling. Unfortunately, the BLM shut it down a few years ago, but I used to go up there, and I can tell you that the more articulation you have, the better. And while that's a good thing for off-road, when you get on-road and you have 500 horsepower, let's say, it can be pretty squirrely. So make sure that suspension is set up right. I think the two-door JK is a good compromise. If you don't have a family, if you're not running Expedition, if you're not loading your Jeep down with groceries and kids and everything else, and you got to remember, that's kind of where the JK was born. The four-door JK basically took the Jeep, which at the time was the TJ, from a specialty vehicle, an off-road vehicle with a pretty anemic engine that was just meant to get to the trail and then run the trail, to a whole new market. 4 doors. It had storage room in the back. So the Expedition guys jumped on it. It was an alternative to the Land Rover. The soccer moms, the entire sport utility vehicle market was opened up to the JK, and it was a massive success. Well over 1 million JKs were sold, and they're really cranking out the JLs right now. I think that the 4-speed 3.8 was a carryover from the philosophy of the TJ, which was just enough power to get it down the road. Jeep kind of learned their lesson early on when they were putting the V8s in the earlier AMC, the CJ7s and things. And while they were V8s, they really weren't that powerful. I don't even think those things were 200 horsepower. But I do remember the size and the weight, and the CJs were tall. I had one friend back in the 70s, I used to call him roll bait, because he rolled that CJ everywhere. So the TJ is a great Jeep. It's not as refined as a JK. It doesn't attract the SUV market like the JK, but off-road, it's great. I've really got a spot in my heart for the 4-liter. It's a great motor. It's a motor from a different generation. The AMC straight 6 really was a solid performer. It was never a performance engine. They put it in the Gremlin, and unfortunately some of the other not so well received vehicles like the Pacer. But as far as reliability and longevity goes, in my opinion, it's better than any of the current engines out. It will outlast a Pentastar, it will outlast a 3.8. just don't expect stellar performance. Now, guys would try to put superchargers on them and punch them out to 4.7 liters, whatever, and had mixed results. We've worked on those, and really, there's nothing like a V8. No matter how hard you try with a V6, turbochargers, superchargers, you're just never going to match the same level of drivability, sound, performance of a V8, in my opinion. It's top of the line. So as the TJ evolved, guys wanted a longer wheelbase. They wanted more room, they wanted more stability, and the LJ was a big success. And look at the prices of the LJs now. They're really going up. They're desirable because it's almost a step to what the JK was going to become. Now, when it comes down to the LJ versus the two-door JK, I'm not an expert on vehicle dynamics and which one wheels better and all that. I've talked to some of the big guys, and most of them basically say it comes down to setup. I think probably the LJ might have an advantage because it is a slightly smaller and lighter vehicle, and that might be why they're getting really desirable. The JK does have a lower center of gravity, and the four-door JK especially has more stability and the ability to haul more people, more luggage, expedition. It really is, in my opinion, the top of the line when it comes to Jeeps. I think Ford spent a lot of time studying the Wrangler JK and JL when they developed the new Bronco. And I was always a fan of the old Bronco. I'm talking the old Bronco up to like 1972 or whatever year, 74, I don't remember what year they dropped it. But I remember the Broncos in the 70s and 80s. They just grew to be so heavy and very inefficient engines and bad gas mileage. And that's not to say that the Blazers and the Ram Chargers at the time weren't the same way. It was just not a very good era for performance. But I do think Ford spent a lot of time looking at the JK because Chrysler hit the nail on the head with that one. What could be better than taking your family out on a road trip and have the ability with the live axles to go wheeling, yet still cruise on the highway thousands of miles? And I drive my JK across the country with the V8. With the V6, it was miserable. In fact, my wife tried to get me to sell her new 09 Rubicon because it was so pathetic on the highway. And while not identical to my Denali, I mean, my Denali, you can cruise at 90 miles an hour all day and not break a sweat. The JK with the tires and the live axle and all that, it's a little noisier, it's a little squirrelier, but I have no problem driving 1,000 miles a day in my JK. And I've got an LS 6.2. And if you get an LT1 with a 10-speed and a JK that's set up properly, it's just a dream. So these are kind of my thoughts on the two-door. The two-door makes sense if you don't have a lot of luggage, you don't have kids, you want something that probably is going to perform a little bit better off-road, has a tighter turning radius. And from what I understand, Chrysler did put a slower ratio gearbox in the two-door to keep the steering not so twitchy. From an engine conversion standpoint, the exhaust really is the major consideration in the two-door. Setting that suspension up properly to avoid vibrations and squirrely driving is really important. I'm going to go back a little ways. My father was in the National Guard, and I do believe it was about the time of Korea. The U.S. was selling surplus Jeeps, and he bought an old Willys Jeep in a crate. You've heard the myth. And he rolled it a couple of times. The things really were dangerous. They had a purpose. You know, I think they were a half-ton utility vehicle for the military. They really weren't meant to go more than 40 miles an hour or such, and they were squirrely. You see those Jeeps on the Rubicon and some of the trails we run, and they're little jackrabbits. They go anywhere. With that flathead four-cylinder, they were quite a force to be reckoned with on the trail, and that was, 50, 60 years ago. It was a brilliant design. But when those Jeeps got into the hand of civilians, they could be very dangerous on the highways. So Jeep did create the CJ, or the civilian Jeep, which addressed all of the issues, but it still had a high center of gravity and a lot of the nuances of the early Willys Jeep. So early on, Jeep and then AMC and Chrysler and Mercedes have realized that Americans really have a passion for off-road vehicles. And nothing has really overtaken the Jeep. And I'm talking about the Wrangler style Jeep, the CJ style Jeep. There's 4Runners and there's Land Rovers and there's all these other four-wheel drive vehicles, and a lot of them are very good. But in the minds of Americans, the solid axle, solid frame Jeep. And things like the Grand Cherokee have really made a mark in the upper markets. I remember back in the 90s, the Grand Wagoneers and then the Grand Cherokees came out, and the affluent people loved them. You had a luxury vehicle you could drive in inclement weather. I would argue that the Land Rover is in a similar category, but you're going to spend double or maybe even 3 times the amount for a Land Rover, so it priced a lot of people out. But getting back to the good old Willys style Jeep realized that there was a big demand for it. And when Chrysler bought AMC, they didn't buy it for their cars. Nobody wanted their cars. They were importing Renaults and other weird things. They wanted the Jeep, and they got the Jeep. And then when the XJ came out, the Cherokee, it really boosted Chrysler into profitability again. And I don't know how many XJs were sold, but they made 2 doors, they made 4 doors. It was a unibody, it was kind of a poor man's Jeep, but it was a great vehicle. And when they matched that with the AMC 6-cylinder, it was a very reliable vehicle. So they had to evolve the CJ, and as you know, they went into the YJ, the square headlight Jeep, which Jeep boasted had a lower center of gravity and a lower entry angle. It was less likely to roll over, but it really was a transitional Jeep to the TJ. The TJ and then the LJ following really became the segue into the JK, because they started to add more amenities. The early Jeeps, the CJs, had metal dashes, very primitive gauges. I remember wheeling them in the 70s, and any kind of a trip over 100 miles was somewhat of an expedition in that thing. So they started to add some luxury features into the TJ, and cruise control and air conditioning and all the things guys want. It still, in my opinion, wasn't a cross-country vehicle. That had to wait until the 4-door JK came out. And when the 4-door JK came out, it was a game changer. Now you do have a vehicle you can drive across the country. Maybe not quite as comfortable as some of the other SUVs, but you have the ability of a very capable off-road vehicle. And just as important was the ability to mod it. The aftermarket jumped in with both feet. Everything from axles, tires, gadgets on the inside. You can pimp your Jeep out to anything you want. It's like a Swiss Army knife. You can make your Jeep be an expedition Jeep. You can have a long-distance economy Jeep. You can have a hardcore off-roader. Whatever you want, you can make your Jeep into. And the 2-door has a place in there. It's never been as popular as the 4-door. So we're going to hit the trail with this Jeep, and we'll be seeing you shortly.